Alyssa Thomas has always been a force to reckon with in the WNBA, a player known for her relentless drive, her grit on the court, and her ability to play through injury with the kind of toughness that would make anyone think she's half machine. She's often praised not only for her skills but for her sheer determination, playing as if the game itself owes her something. Her journey has always seemed to be about proving herself, making each dribble, each pass, a testament to her willpower. But lately, her story took a turn that nobody saw coming, one that doesn't involve game stats or buzzer beaters. There are now whispers and allegations pointing to something far more unsettling: corruption. But before we proceed further, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe. Rumors began swirling shortly after the end of the WNBA season, with murmurs that Thomas might have engaged in some off-court activities that raised eyebrows. What exactly those activities involved was unclear at first, but the speculation was enough to jolt the basketball community. The WNBA, known for its clean image and integrity, wasn't prepared for this kind of headline involving one of its star players. Alyssa Thomas suspected of corruption? It was like finding out your childhood hero wasn't just human but fallible. Thomas's reputation on the court is built on consistency and focus. She's a player who can take a hit and still draw to the basket with a fierceness that turns heads. Yet off the court, it seems there might have been a different game entirely, one with far more stakes than a playoff win. The initial reports were vague, hinting at connections with individuals who seemed too interested in the outcomes of WNBA games. The suggestion alone was enough to spark a frenzy. The WNBA is a league that prides itself on transparency, and these allegations shook that foundation. For fans, it was like watching a perfectly good foundation develop a crack that couldn't be ignored. The idea that a player like Thomas, who practically embodies the sport's hardworking ethos, could be mixed up in something as dirty as corruption was almost too surreal to grasp. If Thomas's integrity could be questioned, what did that mean for the rest of the league? As the story developed, the whispers grew louder, and the allegations started to piece together. There were hints that Thomas might have been involved in influencing game outcomes, not in the obvious way that you see in movies, but subtly, in ways that only someone with an expert understanding of the game could pull off. It wasn't about throwing games or blatant sabotage. It was about nudging things just enough to tilt the scales. The kind of stuff that goes unnoticed unless you know exactly where to look. This revelation hit the WNBA like a sucker punch. The league is a relatively tight-knit community where players, coaches, and fans share a mutual respect for the game and for each other. To see someone as respected as Thomas under suspicion threw everyone into a state of confusion. There was a collective pause, almost like the air had been sucked out of the room. Thomas, who had been seen as a paragon of resilience and dedication, was now being looked at through a lens of suspicion. Some insiders speculated that these allegations could be tied to a larger scheme involving sports betting, an industry that has been creeping its way into almost every corner of professional sports. The connection seemed plausible. Betting has always been a shadow that looms over sports, tempting those looking to make a quick gain or manipulate outcomes for profit. Was it possible that Thomas had fallen into that shadow, using her influence on the court to tip the scales ever so slightly in favor of some unknown benefactor? Thomas's on-court demeanor has always been intense, almost robotic in her focus. It's what makes her such a formidable opponent. But now, people were beginning to wonder if that focus had ever been divided, if her concentration wasn't solely on winning, but on something else entirely. Her fierce competitive nature, which once seemed to be all about pride and victory, now seemed to have a hint of something more calculating. Could it be that every strategic move, every precise play, was more than just skill and instinct? The implications of this scandal rippled through the WNBA like aftershocks from a major quake. For a league still in the process of gaining recognition and respect in the wider sports world, this was a serious blow. The league has been working tirelessly to carve out its identity, to grow its fan base, and to prove that women's basketball is every bit as thrilling as its male counterpart. Scandals like this are precisely what the WNBA doesn't need, especially when it's finally getting the attention it deserves. To the fans, the idea that Thomas might have played a different kind of game altogether felt like a betrayal. It wasn't just about one player, it was about what she represented. She had always been seen as the kind of athlete who played for the love of the game, not for fame or money. Now that image was tarnished, and no one knew how deep the stain went. The questions started to pile up. If someone like Alyssa Thomas could be involved in corruption, how many others were potentially playing the same game? As more details began to emerge, There were those who stood firmly in Thomas's corner, refusing to believe the accusations without concrete proof. They'd argued that it was all too convenient, that a player of her caliber would never risk everything she's worked so hard to build for something so underhanded. To them, Thomas was still the iron-willed competitor who played through pain with a shoulder wrapped in tape, who gave everything to every minute on the floor. On the other side, skeptics were quick to point out that it's often the ones you least suspect who have the most to hide. They'd argued that her intensity, her drive, could easily mask a more calculated side. After all, the best players are always the smartest ones, the ones who know how to use the game's subtleties to their advantage. Maybe Thomas was just too smart, too strategic, to not see the opportunity in influencing outcomes for personal gain. The WNBA's response was swift, but cautious. The league issued a statement promising a thorough investigation, assuring fans and players alike that integrity was their highest priority. There was no rush to judgment, no hasty conclusions. The officials knew they had to tread carefully. They couldn't afford to make a misstep. They were dealing with one of their brightest stars, a player whose reputation had been spotless up to this point. Behind the scenes, the league's investigators were working overtime, sifting through game footage, analyzing Thomas's plays with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for championship finals. They were looking for patterns, any signs that might hint at something more than just competitive strategy. Every pass, every missed shot, every defensive lapse was under the microscope. They were not just looking at the obvious, but the small details that might have gone unnoticed by the untrained eye. Alyssa Thomas herself remained largely silent during the early days of the investigation, which only added fuel to the speculation. She didn't come out with any impassioned speeches about her innocence or fiery denials that she was being framed. She was just quiet, and for a player who's always been so vocal about her love for the game, the silence was almost deafening. Some interpreted it as a sign of guilt, others as the calm before the storm. In the court of public opinion, debates raged on. The sports community, known for its strong opinions and passionate arguments, was divided. Some saw this as yet another example of how even the most honest-seeming players can fall prey to temptation. Others pointed out that these allegations could be a misunderstanding, a misreading of a fiercely competitive player's intent. They argued that corruption in sports isn't always as clear-cut as it appears, that sometimes the lines blur between strategy and dishonesty. As the investigation into Alyssa Thomas's suspected corruption deepened, the story took on a life of its own, becoming the kind of narrative that's hard to look away from. For those who followed her career, the shock had worn off, but the questions remained, multiplying like unchecked rumors in the echo chambers of social media. It was no longer just about what Alyssa might have done. It was about how she, of all people, could have ended up here. This wasn't some rookie with everything to prove or a player nearing retirement with nothing to lose. This was Alyssa Thomas, dependable, disciplined, the heartbeat of every team she'd ever been a part of. The more you dug into her career, the more puzzling the allegations seemed. Thomas's journey in the WNBA was never easy or handed to her. She built her reputation on persistence, the kind that comes from clawing your way up through the ranks, from making your name known not just by scoring points but by being the engine that never stops. Her role in the league was more than just as a star player. She was the example, the template of what hard work could look like in its purest form. It's why the rumors of her involvement in corruption didn't just sting. They felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. For those on the outside, the idea that Thomas could be involved in something as murky as match-fixing or point-shaving seemed like fiction. The kind of plot twist that belongs in a bad sports drama rather than real life. But in the high-stakes world of professional sports, the lines between integrity and deception can blur, especially when money starts to talk. And in this case, it wasn't whispering, it was shouting. The possible involvement of sports betting syndicates started to come to light, hinting at a network that could have reached far beyond just Thomas or the WNBA. This wasn't a simple story of one player's greed or fall from grace. This was a tangled web where different interests collided. For some, it raised the uncomfortable question of just how deep these roots of corruption could go in the sport. If Thomas's name was being mentioned, how many others were still in the shadows, untouched by the spotlight? Those with insider knowledge speculated that Thomas's alleged involvement might have begun innocuously, perhaps as a favor for a friend or as a way to smooth over financial stress. After all, the economics of women's professional basketball aren't exactly glamorous, even for the best players in the league. Many female athletes have to juggle multiple careers or overseas contracts just to sustain their livelihoods in a way their male counterparts don't. The pressure to find security off the court is real, and the temptation to earn a little extra on the side can be overwhelming, even for someone as seemingly untouchable as Thomas. Yet the thought of Thomas compromising her competitive integrity still seemed at odds with everything fans had come to know about her. She was known for giving her all, no matter the situation, pushing her body past its limits just to squeeze out one more point, one more assist. Her intensity was never something that could be faked or staged. It was raw and real, the kind of passion that makes you think she might just live and breathe basketball. And that's what made these allegations cut so deep. Not because people thought she was incapable of wrongdoing, but because it was impossible to reconcile that level of dedication with the idea of her throwing games or manipulating scores. As the investigation picked up steam, other players in the WNBA were forced to confront their own relationship with the game and their trust in the league. In locker rooms across the country, conversations shifted from game strategies and rivalries to whispered doubts about who might be involved, who might be next. There was a growing unease among players, a sense that if Alyssa Thomas could be brought down by this, that no one was safe from scrutiny. Coaches and team officials tried to keep morale high, but there was no escaping the elephant in the room. For every pep talk about unity and focusing on the game, there were undercurrents of distrust that couldn't be ignored. Players started second-guessing each other's performances, analyzing every missed shot or questionable play through a lens of suspicion. The league, once a symbol of solidarity and sisterhood, suddenly felt like it was cracking under the weight of its own disillusionment. Fans, too, found themselves in a difficult position. Some were fiercely loyal, defending Thomas with the same vigor they cheered her on during playoff runs. They argued that without concrete evidence, the accusations were nothing more than a smear campaign against a woman who had given everything to the sport. Others, however, were quick to jump ship, their faith in the purity of the game shaken. For them, Thomas's silence was a sign of complicity, a quiet admission that maybe the rumors were more than just gossip. The media, predictably, had a field day with the unfolding drama. Pundits who had once sung Thomas's praises now dissected her every move, her every interview, searching for clues or cracks in her story. Sports analysts turned into amateur detectives, trying to piece together a timeline of her actions, both on and off the court. Every game she'd played that season was rewatched, reanalyzed, as if the truth lay hidden in plain sight all along. While the league's investigation continued, speculation grew that Thomas's potential involvement in corruption could have far-reaching consequences beyond the WNBA. Sponsors, always wary of their brand's association with controversy, began to reevaluate their partnerships with the league. The WNBA has always struggled to attract the kind of lucrative sponsorship deals that are commonplace in men's sports, and now, with these allegations hanging in the air, those fragile relationships seemed even more at risk. The financial fallout could be devastating, not just for Thomas, but for the entire league. One of the most troubling aspects of the situation was the uncertainty surrounding Thomas's motive. Unlike athletes who have been caught in similar scandals in other sports, Thomas wasn't known for a lifestyle that demanded exorbitant sums of money. There were no flashy cars, no multi-million-dollar mansions, no excessive living that hinted at a need for illicit cash flow. Her public persona had always been grounded, her focus seemingly only on basketball and the simple joys of the game. So, what was it that could have led her down such a perilous path? Some suggested that the motive might not have been financial at all. Perhaps, they speculated, it was a matter of loyalty, an obligation to someone close to her, someone she couldn't say no to. Others wondered if it was about power, the kind of thrill that comes from not just playing the game but controlling it, bending it to your will without anyone else being the wiser. The kind of power that, once tasted, is almost impossible to give up. Whatever the truth was, one thing was clear. The Alyssa Thomas saga had grown far beyond her, or even the WNBA itself. It had become a broader conversation about the integrity of sports, the pressures faced by athletes, and the thin line between ambition and corruption. The world of professional sports has always walked that line, balancing the glory of competition with the darker forces that lurk just beneath the surface, and Thomas's situation had dragged that conflict into the harsh light of day. While the investigation continued, those who knew Thomas best were silent. Friends, teammates, and even former coaches were careful with their words, offering statements that were supportive yet non-committal, like they were standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or step back. They described her as a consummate professional, someone who lived for the game, someone who would never compromise her values. But even in her defense, there was a trace of hesitation, a slight tremor that suggested they didn't know the whole story either. As for Thomas, she seemed to have retreated into a shell, her public appearances few and far between. When she did show up, it was with the same stone-faced determination that had defined her on the court. No smiles, no frowns, just a poker face that gave away nothing. Her demeanor had always been intense, almost impenetrable, but now it seemed to carry a different weight, as if she were playing a game where the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. For all the talk about the investigation, the speculation, the drama, there was still no definitive evidence that could either convict or clear her name. The longer it dragged on, the more polarized opinions became. It was like watching a game with no clear winner, where every move only added to the confusion, where every play left you more uncertain than before. People wanted answers, but it seemed like the truth was content to remain hidden, just out of reach. The implications of Thomas's situation were also starting to be felt at the grassroots level of the sport. Young players, those who had looked up to her as a role model, were now questioning their own dreams of making it to the professional level. Coaches and mentors struggled to explain the situation to their teams without crushing their spirits. How do you teach integrity and sportsmanship when the very figures you hold up as examples are under suspicion of betrayal? The WNBA, despite its efforts to maintain an air of professionalism and control, was caught in a crisis that was bigger than any one player. It wasn't just about dealing with a scandal. It was about safeguarding the future of the league itself. If the allegations against Thomas proved to be true, it would mean not just the fall of a star but a fracture in the trust that holds the league together. And that trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. Alyssa Thomas's case was beginning to feel like a storm that refused to pass, casting its shadow over the entire WNBA. The longer it lingered, the more it seeped into the corners of every conversation, every locker room huddle, and every fan's social media feed. It was no longer just a news story. It was a narrative that had embedded itself in the consciousness of everyone who cared about the sport. Players who once spoke openly about their goals and dreams now chose their words carefully, wary of saying something that might later be twisted or linked back to Thomas's controversy. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, team executives and league officials found themselves in damage control mode. Sponsors needed reassurance, and the league's reputation required a fresh coat of credibility. For a sport already fighting for respect and recognition in the broader athletic landscape, the stakes had never been higher. The WNBA's commitment to growth and progress now felt like it was on thin ice, and everyone was bracing for what might come next. The fear was palpable. If even one crack widened in the league's image, it could set back years of hard-earned progress. As this saga played out, the ripple effects extended beyond the WNBA. Conversations about integrity in sports found their way into podcasts, news segments, and forums that typically focused on male-dominated leagues. Suddenly, the spotlight that had often bypassed women's basketball was glaringly bright, but for all the wrong reasons. People were talking, debating, and analyzing, but not about the game itself. Instead, they dissected trust, ethics, and the pressure that comes with playing at the highest levels. What had started as an isolated incident involving one player had transformed into a broader commentary on the nature of competition and the price of success. For Thomas herself, the toll was unmistakable, even if she rarely let it show. Her once unwavering focus seemed at times to flicker under the strain of scrutiny. She was no longer just a player fighting to win. She was an athlete caught in the relentless crossfire of public opinion, media speculation, and official investigation. The court that had always been her refuge now felt like a stage where every move was under the microscope, where even her most genuine efforts could be second-guessed. As the season reached its end, with no definitive resolution in sight, the echoes of Thomas's legacy hung in the air. What she had built over years of sweat and determination was now balanced on the edge of a verdict that could either exonerate her or redefine her in the eyes of the sport she loved. And as the final buzzer sounded on yet another game, the questions remained unanswered, the truth still elusive, and the story of Alyssa Thomas still very much unfinished. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more engaging content. We thrive on your feedback, so be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Until next time, keep discovering and stay tuned.